Irene Garza was born on November 15, 1934 to Nicholas and Josefina in McAllen, Texas. She was a majorette in her high school band and was crowned the Miss All South Texas Sweetheart in 1958. She then studied at Pan American College, where she was named Homecoming Queen. In 1960, 25-year-old Irene was a second-grade school teacher at Thigpen Elementary School, still living with her parents. On April 16, 1960, she went to confession at the Sacred Heart Church and then strangely disappeared. When she failed to return home, her parents assumed she had stayed for the Easter Vigil, Massachusetts. However, by 3 a.m., when there was still no sign of her, they called the police and reported her missing. Police began searching for her and discovered her car near the church. They also questioned parishioners at the church, and they recalled seeing her that night. 2 days later, on April 18th, a person driving down McAllen Road found her purse, left shoe, and lace veil. This led to a massive search of the area, the largest in Rio Grande Valley's history. Unfortunately, a woman claiming to be Irene called her parents and said she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in nearby Hidalgo. Turned out to be a hoax. Then a man in Edinburgh told a waitress that he murdered Irene, but it was just a cruel joke from a very drunk individual. 5 days after she went missing, her body was discovered floating in an irrigation canal several miles from where her purse and other items were found. She was fully dressed, but her shoes and underwear were missing, and her blouse was unbuttoned. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and suffocated to death. They then drained the canal looking for more evidence, and found a green photo slide viewer. To their surprise, Father John Fite, who was 27 years old at the time, sent police a note saying the photo slide viewer was his. Fite was also the person who heard Irene's last confession. While investigators questioned over 500 people, the only solid suspect was Fite, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime besides the photo slide viewer. The case would then go unsought for many years until it was reopened in 2002. That's when two clergymen named Father Dale Ticini and Father Joseph O'Brien came forward and said that Fate had confessed to murdering her shortly after the crime. Fate had remained a priest until the 70s when he left, married, and started a family. In 2004, the DA brought the case in front of a grand jury, but Fate was not indicted. In 2015, with a new DA in office, they renewed the investigation into Irene's murder. It was discovered that back in 1961, investigators had questioned members of the church and said that on the night of Irene's disappearance, the line for confession was slower than usual. They also noted that Fate was away from the church several times that night. The next day, fellow priests noticed he had scratch marks on his hands. They also found it strange that he had taken Irene to the church rectory for confession instead of the confessional. When questioned about this, he denied the accusation, but later admitted that he had taken her to the rectory. He was then given a polygraph and they said he passed. However, years later, it was revealed that the tests were actually inconclusive. When asked where he went that night, he said he left the sanctuary because he had broken his glasses and drove back to the church's pastoral house to get another pair. He said when he arrived, he had no key, so he climbed into the house on the second floor, and that's where the scratches on his hands came from. 3 weeks before Irene's death, a woman named Maria Gorer was assaulted while kneeling at the communion rail at another Catholic church in the area. She eventually fought off her attacker and said the man looked like a priest from the Catholic Church in Edinburgh, Texas. When rumors began spreading that Fate was responsible, local church leaders covered it up and insisted that a priest could never be involved in a violent crime. While Fate denied attacking Maria, he did admit to being at the church that day. After Irene's murder, Maria picked Fate out of a police lineup as the man who had attacked her. In 1961, Father Fite stood trial in Austin, charged with assault with intent to sexually assault, but the trial ended in a deadlock jury. Rather than face another trial, he later pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of aggravated assault and was fined $500. Fite claimed he did not understand that a no-contest plea would be considered a conviction in the case. Fite was then sent to Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Missouri. An abbot at Assumption Abbey told monk Dale Tacheny that Fight had killed someone and asked Tacheny to cancel Fight for a few months to determine whether he had the disposition to become a monk. Tacheny said that Fight confessed to hurting a young lady and murdering another one, but he said it was not his job to judge him at the time. He then kept the secret to himself until 2002. Since Fight did not enjoy the lifestyle at Assumption Abbey, he was sent to a treatment retreat for troubled priests in Jemez Springs, New Mexico. He then became a staff member and eventually worked his way into a supervisor role. While there, he cleared non-child abuser Father James Porter, who went on to abuse more than 100 children and was later arrested and sentenced to prison for those crimes. Finally, in February 2016, 83-year-old Fate was arrested and charged with her murder. At the time, he was living in Arizona and had to be extradited back to Texas. On December 7, 2017, 57 years after her brutal murder, Veit was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, he wouldn't be in prison long because he died of natural causes in February 2020. Karen Sue Class was born Karen O'Grady on April 22, 1943 in Independence, Missouri. In 1961, she graduated from Santa Ana Senior High School, and then 2 years later in 1963, she met Bill Medley, who co-founded the Righteous Brothers, and by 1964, they were married. They had one son together, but the marriage wouldn't last and they divorced in 1967. She then married Gerald Class, and they also had a son together. In 1976, 32-year-old Karen was living with her sons in Hermosa Beach, California, and had recently broken her leg and had a cast on it. On January 30, 1976, Karen was supposed to meet some of her neighbors for coffee after taking her youngest child to the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, but never showed up. At the time, her oldest son was with his father, Bill. After failing to show up, they tried calling her, but there was no answer. So, they went by her home, entered through the rear door and called out for her, but received no response. So, they walked around to the front of the house and saw a man with bushy, curly brown hair leaving. They became terrified after realizing he matched the description of a man seen loitering around the neighborhood that week. After calling the police, Karen was found on the floor, nude and unconscious. She was rushed to the hospital and remained in a coma until she died on February 3rd. An autopsy determined she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. They also determined that she was murdered after returning home around 9 a.m. and that the suspect was likely inside waiting on her. Thankfully, they were able to collect evidence that would later be used for DNA testing, but the case would still go unsolved for the next 41 years. In 2016, the DNA was sent off for forensic genetic genealogy and produced a potential suspect. With further investigative work, detectives were led to a man by the name of Kenneth Eugene Troyer, who was 29 years old at the time of the murder. However, he would never be arrested because he died in a shootout with police in 1982 after escaping from a California men's colony state prison in St. Louis Obispo. At the time, he was behind bars for burglary, but was suspected of committing multiple sexual assaults and robberies in Orange County. Thankfully, the Orange County Coroner's Office had a sample of his DNA that was used to make the connection. Prisma was born on August 25, 1985 in Walker County, Georgia. When he was younger, he met Samantha Lynn Lemming, and by the time she was 16 and Adam was 17, they were married. After the wedding, Adam and Samantha moved into a trailer on Mohawk Road in Rossville, Georgia. In 2002, the same year they married, they met 51-year-old Howard Hawk Willis. Willis was a trucker out of Georgia who was out on bond after an arrest in New York for smuggling cocaine from Texas to Brooklyn. Unfortunately, this would be the biggest mistake of their lives. They all three became friends and were regular visitors at his mother Betty's home in Johnson City, Tennessee throughout 2002. However, by October of that year, the teens strangely went missing. They were last seen on October 4, 2002 at a Pizza Hut in Chattanooga, where Samantha's mother lived. They were being driven by Willis in Betty's red Jeep. After that day, she was never able to get in touch with her daughter again. That same day, Adam called his mother, who was also familiar with Willis at this point, crying and asking to come home. Just like Samantha's mom, she never heard from her son again after that day. On or about October 7th or 8th, Ms. Chrismare received a phone call from a Bradley County detective who was looking for Adam to question him about Willis's stepfather Samuel Thomas's disappearance. She knew at that moment something bad had happened. In the meanwhile, she had been trying to call Adam on the number he gave her, but no one answered, so she left a message. Willis finally called her back and she asked where Adam was. He told her the last time he saw Adam was at his trailer in Rossville. During the conversation, she could hear two women in the background talking and Willis was trying to get them to shut up. She noted that during the conversation, he was very calm and acted like nothing was wrong. Willis was scheduled to meet with law enforcement in Bradley County on October 4, 2002, but called and said he couldn't make it. When he arrived on October 8, 2002, they asked if he knew where Adam and Samantha were. He said he hadn't seen them since the 4th and thought they were possibly at their home in Georgia. At that point, they began suspecting he was involved in their disappearance. On October 10, 2002, they arrested Willis on federal drug charges at his aunt's home in Johnson City. Once in jail that day, they recorded a conversation between him and his mother, Betty, where she referred to a storage unit and Willis quickly told her to shut up. Investigators began calling around and found that Betty had rented Unit X47 at the 24-hour self-storage facility in Johnson City, Tennessee. Officers went to the unit, but it was padlocked. However, they could smell the scent of decay. After obtaining a search warrant and opening the unit, they sadly found Adam and Samantha's bodies. They were found inside 50-gallon plastic totes and had been dead for a few days. Some of Adam's remains were missing and later found by a fisherman during a fishing tournament on Boone Lake. Investigators determined that Willis cut up Adam with a chainsaw in order to fit him in the Rubbermaid container. It's believed that Adam was murdered first, between October 6th and October 8th. As for Samantha, they estimate her death between October 7th and October 9th. On October 17, 2002, they searched his mother Betty's home and found a box of Winchester .32 caliber ammunition in an attached garage. It matched the same bullets that were used to kill Adam and Samantha. They also described her house as having a foul odor with flies and larvae present. Plus, the carpet had been ripped up. A few days later, they discovered the remains of his stepfather, Sam. After being arrested, his ex-wife, Wilda, went to the police station at 9 p.m. and spoke with detectives. It was during that conversation that they agreed to work together to try and get a confession recorded. She then went to the jail and met with Willis and recorded him giving her directions to a chainsaw that was used during the crime. The chainsaw was ultimately found along Interstate 75 in Bradley County. On the second visit with him, she recorded him confessing to the murders. He claimed the reason he murdered them was because Adam robbed and murdered his stepfather, Sam, who had disappeared in early September 2002. Investigators believe it's possible that all three were involved in the murder of Thomas because they were caught on a business surveillance camera using one of his credit cards after he disappeared. They believe the teens were hanging around Willis because he was giving them drugs in exchange for sex. During Willis's trial, Betty's neighbor Wilma Clay testified that she saw Willis, his daughter Kelly, along with Adam and Samantha between April and September of 2002. After September, she never saw them again. On October 5, 2002, Wilma went outside to smoke and saw Willis standing outside next to her mother's red Jeep, also smoking. When he was finished, he grabbed a black plastic bag from the back of the Jeep and threw it on the ground. When she came back out later, she saw the garage closed with the light on, which she said was unusual. It's believed this is when he was taking care of Adam's body. On June 21, 2010, Willis was found guilty of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder and 1 count of felony murder in perpetration of kidnapping and was sentenced to death. He's also a suspect in the disappearance of his first wife, Deborah Willis, who went missing on December 23, 1986. As for his mother, Betty, aka Emma Elizabeth Hawk, she was arrested and charged with corpse abuse, accessory to first-degree murder, and attempting to tamper with evidence. However, she would never be convicted because she died in 2009 at the age of 78. His aunt, 74-year-old Marie Hawk Holmes, was also charged with an attempt to tamper with evidence. It's alleged that she tried to convince Wilda to destroy the tape recording of Willis's confession. All the charges against her were later dismissed, and she passed away in 2011. Willis has tried to get a new trial, but those attempts have been denied, and as of 2024, he remains on death row. Steve Gaddara was born on July 23, 1964, and grew up in Kingsburg, California. He was a student at Kingsburg High School and was a member of the school's wrestling team and also played football his freshman year. By 1989, 24-year-old Steve was a single father raising his 1-year-old daughter Sasha and working as a construction foreman. Sadly, all that would be taken away from him. On April 8, 1989, Steve and his girlfriend Deanna Daniels were heading back to the break room bar in Visalia so Deanna could get her car when a truck came up behind them near Murray Avenue and Willis Street, flashing their headlights and honking the horn. After pulling into the bar's parking lot, Steve got out and asked the driver what he needed. All of a sudden, the driver Jason Alvarez slammed his door open and hit Steve, and the passenger Elio Benavente came around and attacked him. During the fight between all three men, Steve was stabbed multiple times. After the murder, the men fled the scene, and Deanna tried to stop them by unsuccessfully lunging for the keys inside. Steve was rushed to the hospital where he was sadly pronounced dead on arrival. For hours later, the truck was found about 4 blocks away with Jason dead inside. Apparently, Elio had accidentally stabbed him during the altercation. Elio's father, Juan Benavente, brought his son to the police station for an interview, but they were unaware that he was involved in the murders, so they never had Deanna come down and identify him. I also read that they knew he was involved but lacked the evidence to arrest him. However, I feel like if that was true, they would have had Deanna come down and identify him through a police lineup. Regardless, after the interview, he was released. Days later, when the fingerprint results from the knife came back, they matched Elio, and a warrant was put out for his arrest. However, he was nowhere to be found. Steve's mother, Marlene, and his daughter, Sasha, would spend the next 27 years seeking justice. In 2016, police tracked Elio down in Mexico with the help of Mexican law enforcement. Once he was in custody, authorities in Mexico walked him to the border in El Paso, Texas, and handed him over to U.S. law enforcement. He was then charged with the murders of Steve and Jason. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison. I was not able to find the reason behind the initial argument between Steve and Jason. Maybe it was a road rage incident, or maybe Steve encountered Jason earlier in the night. Sadly, Deanna experienced another loss in her life in 2009 when her husband of 3 years died in a motorcycle accident. Then on June 1, 2019, she died due to an accident in her home. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966, in Alsos, Oklahoma. In 1984, she graduated from Blanchard High School and then went on to study political science at the University of Oklahoma. After graduating in 1987, she enrolled in law school and obtained her law degree in 1990. She began practicing law in Oklahoma City before working in the DA's office in Clark County, Nevada. After that, she went back to practicing private law in Nevada. By 2015, 48-year-old Susan had been married to Dr. Gregory Brent Dennis, a psychologist who went by his middle name, for 20 years and was living in Henderson, Nevada with her 2 daughters. Unfortunately, her marriage to Brent was not all it was made out to be, and in January 2015, everything would come crumbling down. On January 3rd, Brent called 911 saying that he found Susan unconscious. During the call, he handed the phone to his daughter so he could perform CPR. Once emergency services arrived, she was rushed to the hospital in critical condition and placed on life support. Strangely, there were no external injuries except for a mark on her nose, which could have occurred during CPR. Since Susan had a DNR, which means do not resuscitate, she was taken off life support and died. When the toxicology report came back, it showed high levels of ethylene glycol, the main active ingredient in antifreeze. Plus, there was oxycodone and Xanax in her system. Brent was brought in for questioning and said that Susan had been depressed and had talked about taking her own life. He said on the day he found her unconscious, he took the girls shopping to get them out of the house. And when he returned at 10:30 p.m., he found her asleep with the laptop nearby. He claimed that he saw a search about using antifreeze to kill herself. Believing she was passed out from drinking, he unsuccessfully tried to wake her. That's when he claims he called 911. The couple's daughters also confirmed Susan's state of mind. After the medical examiner received the toxicology report, he ruled that she took her own life using oxycodone, Xanax, and ethylene glycol. The case was then subsequently closed. Thankfully, her parents didn't believe the ruling and decided to hire a team of private investigators to look into the case. They couldn't get past the fact that Susan was not prescribed oxycodone and didn't know how she got access to it. The first thing the private investigators did was question Brent as to why he took Susan off life support so quickly and then had her cremated once she died, which loved ones didn't find out about until her funeral on January 9th. His explanation for the cremation was that he injured her nose while trying to resuscitate her. At that point, the private investigators knew they needed to put Brent under constant surveillance, so they spent 15 hours a day, 7 days a week watching him. During that time, they observed him traveling to an area of Las Vegas known for prostitution and drug activity. He was also spending time at the Orleans Hotel and Casino. They watched as he took an elevator to the upper floor of the hotel, returning 10 minutes later. They theorized that he was getting drugs from someone at the casino several times a week and sometimes twice a day. They had also witnessed him doing drugs in a car in a parking lot. If all this was true, he had a very expensive drug habit. Now they had a possible motive, money. So they looked into the couple's financials and discovered that Susan had an insurance policy. Grant had even reached out to the company to make sure it would pay even if she took her own life. That insurance policy ultimately paid $1 million. He had also drained $180,000 from her personal bank account. Equipped with the new evidence, they went to a civil attorney but were told they needed even more proof. So investigators went to great lengths to discover the name of the person he was visiting at the hotel. That person turned out to be Jeffrey Crosby, who had a prior conviction of drug trafficking. Once the civil attorney, Tony Segro, was on board, a wrongful death suit was filed. Segro then submitted a subpoena to get their computer, and based on the timestamps from the search history for Anna Fries, it was determined that Brent, not Susan, performed the internet searches. During the civil trial, Brent took the stand and was asked if Susan had threatened to expose his drug use 2 to 3 days before her death. But he responded that he had no clear memory of that. While he was forthcoming about his drug use, he was unaware that private investigators had caught him on camera getting the drugs. They had also obtained proof that Susan tried to call the drug dealer herself a couple of days before she died. She was most likely trying to figure out the details of her husband's drug use, given some of the details that emerged during the deposition. The Henderson Police Department decided to reopen the case and assigned a new detective. That detective determined from Brent's cell phone records that he contacted Crosby the night Susan died and had gone to the hotel. It's believed that's where the oxycodone came from. They also learned that Brent was buying medication from his patients. Because of this, they believe he murdered Susan because he was afraid that a divorce would reveal his drug use, and caused him to lose his medical license, ultimately destroying his life. The Clark County Coroner's Office re-reviewed the evidence and changed her cause of death to undetermined instead of taking her own life. Brent was then arrested and charged with Susan's murder on February 2, 2017, 2 years after she died. In the end, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. Unfortunately, he will be eligible for parole next year on May 4, 2025. In 2020, 37-year-old Amanda Davis, a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, was living in Nixon, Nevada with her 3 children. Amanda was described as a devoted mother who always fought to protect her children. She was also pregnant with her 4th child by her boyfriend, 36-year-old Michael Burciaga. She was super excited about the pregnancy and had already picked out the name Ezra Aaron Davis. Sadly, all that would be taken away from her in December of 2020. Shortly after midnight on December 15th, Amanda's 15-year-old daughter called the police to report that her mom had been stabbed. When officers arrived, the kids told them that Michael had stabbed their mother. When they went into the bedroom, they sadly found Amanda lying face down. When Michael first stabbed Amanda, her 8-year-old son had witnessed it and ran and woke up his older sister. All three kids then rushed to check on their mother and thankfully found her still alive in her bedroom. In a panic state, they decided to barricade the door with a dresser. Unfortunately, the dresser didn't block the entire door, and when Michael came back to finish Amanda off, he was able to break through the top half. Amanda tried to fend him off with a baseball bat by hitting his hand, but he was still able to get through. Even Amanda's daughter tried hitting him with a lamp, but nothing worked. After a second attack on Amanda, he fled the home. While the officers were on the scene, the kids started screaming. And I quote, "He's back, he's back." They rushed them into the kitchen and went outside to find Michael standing there. He had apparently tried to take his own life by cutting one of his wrists. He told officers, and I quote, "I already know what happened and I know what I did, which is why I slit my wrist." After being treated at the hospital, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, a violation of the Protection of Unborn Children Act and domestic assault by a habitual offender. Meanwhile, paramedics tried to save Amanda, but sadly, she died at the scene along with her unborn son, who was due the following February. Michael had a history of domestic assault and domestic battery. In the end, he was convicted for Amanda's murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. Marcus Jackson Feasel was born in Middletown, Ohio on June 24, 2003. He lived there with his mother Donna Trevino and his siblings Michael and Peaches. Marcus was said to love flowers, Bob the Builder, and blowing bubbles. He was autistic and attended a school for children with special needs. Unfortunately, Donna's boyfriend was very abusive towards her, making it harder for her to cater to Marcus's needs. The police had even been called out multiple times due to the domestic violence and noted that the house was flea-infested and smelled of feces. On one of those calls on September 29, 2005, police observed severe bruising on Marcus' buttock, which led to an investigation by child welfare workers. In January of 2006, he crawled out a second-story window, fell, and had to have stitches in his chin. In April of 2006, he was found wandering the streets and narrowly avoided being hit by a car. Donna admitted to being overwhelmed and even told police that she wasn't sure she could continue caring for her children. After that, Marcus was placed in the care of foster parents, Liz and David Carroll, who had 4 children of their own. The process was handled by a private agency called Lifeway for Youth, and they were unaware of David's mental health issues. If they had known, it would have most certainly disqualified them from being foster parents. If that wasn't bad enough, he also had his girlfriend, Amy Baker, living in the home with her 3 children. In June of 2006, David was arrested on a domestic violence charge, but it was later dismissed and he failed to report it to Lifeway for Youth. Unfortunately, after Marcus moved in with them, Liz and Amy began focusing all their attention on him, which angered David. Then, in early August of 2006, Marcus strangely disappeared and wasn't reported missing until August 15th. Liz said she had blacked out due to low blood pressure at Julfs Park, and when she woke up, Marcus was gone. Even stranger was the fact that she had 3 other children with her at the time, and no witnesses at the park recalled seeing Marcus that day. Authorities and volunteers searched the area and the surrounding neighborhoods, but no sign of Marcus was found. At this point, the investigators were questioning Liz's story, and she most likely knew it because on August 22, 2006, she held a press conference and appealed to the public for Marcus's return. However, it was all a lie, and Amy, who turned state witness, would let the cat out of the bag. The real story of what happened to Marcus is a sad, horrible tale. Liz, David, and Amy were heading to a family reunion in Williamstown, Kentucky that took place from August 4th through August 6th. Instead of bringing him along, they wrapped him in a blanket that was wrapped with tape and placed him inside a closet with no food or water. When they returned at the end of the weekend, Marcus was dead. So they took his body to an abandoned 88-acre property with a house that burned in the 1960s that still had the chimney intact. Once there, They put the remains inside the chimney and continued burning them until very little remained. When they felt the remains could be burned no further, they collected what was left and dumped them in the Ohio River. When investigators searched the abandoned property, they found bone fragments still inside the chimney. Those fragments were tested and positively belonged to Marcus. On August 28, 2006, Liz and David were brought in front of a grand jury. After providing their testimony, where Liz had the audacity to say, "I didn't have any intentions of hurting him," they were both indicted for Marcus's murder. Amy was granted immunity in Ohio, which is even more shocking when you learn that David and Amy were the ones who burned the remains and dumped what was left in the Ohio River. The following day, on August 29th, the Carrolls, who had already been charged with involuntary manslaughter and endangering children, also had the additional charges of making false alarms and inducing panic. In addition, David was charged with gross abuse of a corpse and Liz was charged with perjury. In the end, Liz was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 54 years to life. As for David, he took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to murder and gross abuse of a corpse and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He also said that Amy was the one who bound Marcus. Finally, 3 months after Liz's trial, on April 20th, 2007, Amy was charged by Kentucky for evidence tampering. They argued that her immunity was only valid in the state of Ohio and that the Ohio River was under Kentucky jurisdiction. Her trial was set for November 7, 2007 in Maysville, Kentucky, but by early 2008 it never happened and all charges were dropped. Meanwhile, Marcus's mother, Donna, decided to capitalize on her son's death and sued the county, Liz, David, Amy, and Lifeway for $5 million. The same month that Liz was found guilty in February of 2007, Donna's suit was settled for $206,000, which was placed in a trust fund to be split between Marcus's siblings, Michael and Peaches, as long as they remained in foster care. If Donna regained custody, she would get the money, but from my research, it doesn't appear she ever tried. After all was said and done, Lifeway for Youth had its license revoked and was forced to close its doors. However, they soon reopened under the name Benchmark, which is still in operation today. Shauna Beth Garber was born in Iola, Kansas on March 1, 1968. Unfortunately, Shauna dealt with abuse from her mother, and in 1973, that abuse escalated beyond the imaginable. Late one night, her mother took Shauna, poured lighter fluid on her, and lit a match. She survived but was hospitalized to treat the severe burns. After that, she and her half-siblings were placed in the foster care system. After she was discharged from the hospital, she was sent to live with a different foster family than her siblings. At that point, she began bouncing from home to home. A few months after all the children were placed with different foster families, in March of 1974, caseworkers gathered Shauna and Rob to celebrate their birthdays, which were only 2 days apart. Sadly, that was the last time he saw his sister alive. Rob was the only one of his 3 half-siblings to be placed with a loving foster family, which provided him with a good life. As we move to talking about Shauna's adult life, I have to inform y'all that there are no photos of her from that time. When Rob turned 18, he set out to find his 16-year-old sister and wrote 2 letters, which he handed over to the Child Welfare Office in Dodge City, hoping they could give them to her. They gave her the first letter immediately, which basically said that Rob loved her and that she could come live with him in 2 years. The second letter was to be opened when she was 18 and contained all his contact information. When their other half-sibling Danielle turned 18, she set out to look for her family as well and discovered Rob first. From there, they searched together for Shauna and eventually were able to track down her first foster family. The foster mother said that when Shauna moved in with her, her face was severely burned and she was in a constant state of panic. The last known details of Shauna are from when she was 22 years old. That year she visited Claremore, Oklahoma to try to find her family. However, unable to find her half-siblings, she ended up working in McDonald County, Missouri, a couple of hours away. Sadly, she would never get to see her half-siblings again. On Sunday, December 2nd, 1990, a husband and wife were walking after church along Oscar Talley Road, near an abandoned McDonald County farmhouse. when they noticed a skull. After calling the police, the rest of the female's remains were found. The woman's body had been bound with several materials including a phone cord, nylon rope, and a clothesline. Also, her hands had been bound behind her back and tied to one foot. An autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and murdered about 6 weeks before being found. The green parachute cord used to strangle her was a military issue sold in the 1990s. Unfortunately, they were unable to identify her, and she became known as Gray Stove. In 2009, her skeletal remains were sent to Namas, and a DNA profile was created and uploaded to Cody's, but no matches were found. A facial reconstruction was then created, but it didn't help identify her. In 2020, with the help of Othram and forensic genetic genealogy, they were able to identify the remains as belonging to Shauna. After the identification, they called and notified Danielle, who said they had been looking for her for the last 28 years. Shauna had married at some point and her last name changed to Harvey, but strangely her husband never reported her missing. It's unknown if they were together when she was murdered. Now that she was identified, investigators got to work tracking down her killer. For 3 years, they investigated the case and were eventually led to a man named Toph Reeves. Reeves had a long criminal record dating back to the 1980s, which included first-degree assault and drug trafficking. However, he would never face justice because he died on November 5, 2021 after performing an illegal U-turn that resulted in a fatal car accident. It was his death that prompted a witness to come forward and finally reveal that he was the one who murdered Shauna. On Halloween night in 1990, Reeves picked Shauna up from the side of the road. After picking her up, he hogtied her and took her to the abandoned farmhouse where he proceeded to sexually assault her. All the while, Shauna was screaming for help and those screams were echoing through the valley. Unfortunately, Reeves was worried the screams would get him caught, so he overdosed her with drugs. If Taufi Reeves was still alive, he would be charged with her murder. Vanessa Teresa Marquardt was born in Leominster, Massachusetts on June 17, 1989 to parents John and Rosanna. After high school, she earned a bachelor's degree in communications from Boston University. She then got a job at an online marketing software startup called WordStream and later worked at Vistaprint. In January 2015, she moved to New York City after getting her dream job as an account manager for Google. In August of 2016, 27-year-old Vanessa went to visit her mother in Princeton, Massachusetts. On Sunday, August 7th, she went for a walk on Brook Station's road but never returned. During her walk, she had her headphones in and was texting her cousin Caroline Tochi. At some point, she stopped at the Mountainside Market on Hubbardston Road for a drink and was last seen sometime between 1:15 and 2 p.m. Witnesses would later say that a vehicle had been following her. Later that day, Vanessa's body was sadly discovered less than half a mile from her mother's house. She was found strangled to death in a wooded area and had also been severely beaten. She was naked and her killer had tried to set the remains on fire. Investigators believe the motive was sexual assault. Missing were her clothes, cell phone, and headphones. Thankfully, they were able to collect male DNA from under her fingernails. In an attempt to locate her killer, investigators opened a 24-hour tip line and received over 1,300 tips. 2 months after her murder, in November 2016, they began asking the public for help in finding a black or dark-colored SUV that had been parked on the road in the area around the time Vanessa was killed. A few months went by with no solid leads until a Massachusetts state trooper in Worcester, about 20 miles from Princeton, happened to see a vehicle that matched the one seen on the day of Vanessa's murder. He wrote down the license plate number and determined it belonged to 31-year-old Angelo Colon Ortiz. The following day, he went by Angelo's home and asked him for a DNA sample, which he voluntarily gave. Lo and behold, his DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene. On April 15, 2017, Angelo was arrested and charged with murder, aggravated assault, and assault with intent to sexually assault. Angelo later claimed that the DNA sample was not voluntary and that he was confused due to a language barrier. However, his attorney's attempts to suppress the DNA evidence were denied. Angelo had no criminal record and was married with 3 children. He also worked for a third-party contractor of FedEx and delivered packages in the area of the murder. His neighbors weren't surprised by his arrest and described him as a pervert and said he often made vulgar sexual comments to people around the neighborhood. A former female postal worker in Princeton came forward and said that Angelo had made crude comments to her in Spanish and had done the same to other female co-workers as well. Thankfully, a local resident recalled seeing Angelo on the day of Vanessa's murder around 12:45 p.m. standing outside his parked black SUV with the hood up talking on his cell phone. Cell phone records also back this up. When the person drove back by at 2:05 p.m., the SUV was still there, but the hood was back down and no one was around. 6 minutes later, Vanessa's phone was shut off. Investigators also discovered that he purchased $5 worth of gas from a store in Rutland about 6 miles away. This is important because he attempted to use gas to try and burn her remains, and it was found on her hair tie and socks. Since Angelo was not working that day, it's unclear why he was in the area. However, considering that Vanessa left her mother's home around 1 p.m., and Angelo was seen parked on the side of the road 15 to 30 minutes earlier, could he have been waiting for her? I did read that she used to travel to Princeton a couple of times a month to visit her mother and aunt, so it's possible he had seen her before. In the end, Angelo pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 45 years. Jacob Patrick Colin Shane was born in Hendricks County, Indiana on July 20, 2013 to Alyssa and Jesse Collin. In 2017, 4-year-old Jacob was living with his mother and 5-year-old sister at his home in Danville, Indiana, along with her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael Atkinson, and his 2 children ages 1 and 3. Jacob was diagnosed with high-functioning autism, OCD, and defiance disorder and required medication. He was said to be a very active child who could be difficult to control at times. In early November 2017, Jacob was sick with a fever and runny nose and had even vomited once. By November 11th, he was improving but still wasn't quite himself. Alyssa decided to take her children to the mall to spend time with their grandmother. While there, everything with Jacob appeared fine. Later that evening, she left her children with Michael so she could attend a concert with friends. Around 10:30 that night, Michael sent Alyssa a text that read, "911, please call." After he spoke with Alyssa, instructing her to come home immediately, he called 911 and reported that Jacob was unconscious in the home. When officers and paramedics arrived, they found Jacob and began performing CPR. Once they had him revived, they rushed him to the hospital and placed him on a ventilator. Sadly, 2 days later, he died from his injuries. Doctors would find that Jacob had bruises all over the back of his head and knee. The doctor overseeing his case also determined that Jacob most likely suffered from internal bleeding and a shattered spleen. When Alyssa arrived at the hospital, she told the doctor his wounds were self-inflicted, but the doctor wasn't buying it and relayed his suspicions to investigators. They asked Michael to walk them through the events of the night. He said that Jacob had an accident, so he put him in the shower to clean him up. For some reason, he left him there and only returned after he heard a thud. When he went back into the bathroom at 6:16 p.m., he said Jacob had fallen and hit his head and there was blood in the tub. He said afterward at about 7 p.m., Jacob seemed fine and went into the living room to watch a movie. However, he began complaining that his stomach and head were hurting. Then around 10:30, he said that Jacob's breathing changed. At 11 p.m., he put him to bed, and then claimed when he went back to check on him 15 minutes later, he found him unresponsive. The biggest problem with his story is that it conflicts with his text to Alyssa at 10:30 p.m. asking her to call 911. Why would he tell her to call 911 and then put the boy to bed 30 minutes later? During the investigation, Alyssa continued to defend Michael. However, one of the other children in the home said there were crashing sounds in the bathroom when Jacob got hurt. Meanwhile, DCS had Michael's 2 children removed from the home. When the autopsy came back on January 11, 2018, it blew a hole right in Michael's story. The autopsy showed that Jacob died from multiple blunt force traumatic injuries, and his death was ruled a homicide. Investigators searched the home and found blood on the bath rug, bath towels, and the pillows on Jacob's bed. They also obtained video from a nanny cam that was in Jacob's room, but strangely, some of the footage had been deleted or the recording was paused. Regardless, the video they did have didn't show Michael coming back to check on Jacob. Michael was then arrested and charged with aggravated battery, resulting in the death and neglect of a dependent. Come to find out, multiple family members and friends were aware of the abuse against Jacob. However, it's unclear if they ever reported it to DCS. In the end, the jury found Michael guilty on all the counts and he was sentenced to 65 years behind bars. Sofia Marlene Silva was born on July 1, 1980 to parents Phyllis and Humberta. In late summer of 1996, 16-year-old Sofia was living in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and was a student at Cortland High School. Friends described her as quiet and reserved and said she loved all things purple. Her goal was to become a beautician, and she was already taking cosmetology classes as part of her high school curriculum. Unfortunately, all her dreams were shattered when her life was suddenly cut short. On Monday morning, September 9, 1996, Sofia's day started out as usual with a ride from her friend, Sherry Moden, in her red Hyundai car. On the way to school, they stopped at Fast Mart as they typically did and bought a soda and some gum. After school, she was given a ride home by Melania and her twin sister, Angela. Went home, she called and spoke with Sherry for about half an hour and discussed possibly going to the Cougars' first football game. After hanging up with Sherry, she took her homework and a can of grape soda and went and sat on the front stoop of her house. Unfortunately, after that, she was never seen alive again. By 9:30 p.m., when her parents were unable to locate her, they called the police and reported her missing. Loads of people from the community, including family and friends, gathered at the Silva house where authorities were organizing a search. Volunteers and rescue teams, including dogs and helicopters, scoured the area but sadly found nothing. 5 weeks later, on October 14th, workers breaking up a beaver dam 20 miles east of Spotsylvania found Sofia's body wrapped in a light blue moving blanket. Unfortunately, due to the decomposition, the medical examiner couldn't be 100% sure how she died, but said it was likely she was stabbed and strangled to death. While she was clothed, she was missing her socks, shoes, and underwear. They also took note that her private part was shaved and believed her killer was responsible. I'm not sure how they came to this conclusion because Sofia could have easily done that herself. However, this would be a vital part of the investigation. There were many suspects, but one stood out to investigators: a 44-year-old house painter named Carl Michael Roche. Roche was renting a basement room 7 houses down from Sofia's home. His landlord told police that Roche would sit in his van and watch the neighborhood kids. He also said that as soon as Sofia went missing, his behavior changed. He began to drink heavily and then abruptly moved out 2 weeks later, leaving behind some of his belongings. Investigators were able to get a search warrant to search Roche's van and were able to collect fiber evidence. They also spoke to his ex-wife, 34-year-old Sharon Home, and asked if she had ever been abused by him or forced to shave her private part, and she said no. Meanwhile, Roche had moved to Florida, unaware that investigators were looking for him. So his ex, Sharon, called and told him he needed to come back to Spotsylvania. So he packed his stuff and headed back to Virginia, arriving around Thanksgiving 1996. Police immediately arrested him because of an outstanding charge for shoplifting a VCR. While in jail, he allegedly began taking credit for Sofia's murder. To this day, he denies this. By January 8, 1997, investigators got the break they were looking for when fibers from Roche's van matched fibers found on Sofia. He was then indicted and charged with abduction with intent to defile and murder. They were moving forward with the fiber evidence, even though the DNA evidence didn't conclusively implicate him. So they began thinking there was more than one contributor and said that she possibly had sex with her boyfriend before she was murdered. However, her friends said she wasn't sexually active and didn't even have a boyfriend. If there was only one contributor, then it basically ruled Roche out. 8 months after Sofia's murder, on May 1, 1997, sisters 12-year-old Katie and 15-year-old Christy Lisk disappeared. 5 days later, their bodies were found floating in the South Anna River, 40 miles south of Spotsylvania. Just like Sophia, there was little to no evidence, besides some fibers and a couple of strands of hair. Investigators also insisted that the cases were not linked, most likely because Roche was still in jail and they felt they already had their man. This wasn't helped by the forensic examiner Robin McLaughlin, who insisted the fibers found in his van matched those found on Sophia. It would later be revealed that the fibers never matched, and in the end, McLaughlin lost her job for the error. Plus, there was only one contributor, which means they were holding an innocent man in jail. At that point, all charges against Roche were dropped. As for Katie and Christy, the fibers found on them were pink, which made FBI Special Agent Doug Diedrich believe they came from some kind of bath rug. There were also dark blue acrylic fibers found on all three girls. They also noted that the oldest sister's private part was shaved just like Sophia's. They began to wonder if that was the serial killer's signature. This idea began to solidify once forensics discovered loose, shaved hair in Christie's shorts. With the new evidence linking the cases, they were certain a serial killer was wreaking havoc on Spotsylvania. Unfortunately, the case would then go unsolved for 5 years. That is until June 2002, when 15-year-old Kara Robinson was out watering flowers in her front yard and was abducted in broad daylight in Columbia, South Carolina. The girl was forced by her kidnapper into a container that he put in the trunk of his car. He then drove her to his apartment where he handcuffed her and then repeatedly sexually assaulted her for the next 18 hours. Thankfully, when 38-year-old Richard Mark Avonis fell asleep, the girl was able to escape. She then led the police back to the apartment, but Avonis had already fled. Authorities called up to him 2 days later in Sarasota, Florida. However, he would never be taken into custody because he took his own life after being trapped in his vehicle following a high-speed police chase. Richard Mark Edward Avonis was born to Joseph and Tess on July 29, 1963 in Columbia, South Carolina, the oldest of 2 siblings. Richard's home was very dysfunctional, with his father, Joseph, being responsible for most of the abuse against the children. Joseph was an alcoholic who was frequently passed out due to his excessive drinking. When Richard was 6 years old, Joseph drowned his dog in front of him and then attempted to drown him. Both Richard's wives said he would wake up from horrible nightmares involving his father. Richard's sister Jennifer said their father ran the house like a prison. She said he was a very sadistic man who would beat them if they didn't get straight A's in school. She said her father was only happy when he was making them miserable. Unfortunately, Richard would develop the same misogynist attitude as his father and even dealt with extreme anger issues. After high school, Richard joined the Navy, where he served as a sonar technician. After being discharged from the military, he bounced around to different jobs before filing bankruptcy in 1997. His first run-in with the law was in 1987, when he exposed himself to a 15-year-old girl and her 3-year-old sister. He's also a suspect in the murder of Sarah Cherry. While Dennis Ducheney was convicted for her murder, some believe he might be innocent. He's also a suspect in the cases of Alicia Showwater Reynolds and in Carolyn McDaniel, who were both murdered in 1996 and found within 10 miles of each other near Charlottesville, Virginia. Investigators also learned that he lived in Fredericksburg, about 15 miles from Spotsylvania. Around the time of Sophia and the List sisters at that point, they began to wonder if Avonis could be the serial killer they'd been looking for. Interestingly, they found a newspaper clipping in his current apartment about the abduction of the List sisters. They would then find Christie's palm print inside a boot inside his car, which is crazy considering it had been 5 years since her murder. Upon searching his former home in Fredericksburg, they found the carpet fibers that matched the ones found on Sophia, Christy, and Katie. There's also the fact that after he fled his apartment, he called one of his sisters and told her he committed more crimes than he could remember. He wanted her to meet him at an IHOP in Jacksonville, Florida, but instead, she called the police and turned him in. On August 14, 2002, he was officially named the prime suspect in the murders of Sophia, Christy, and Katie, and their cases were subsequently closed. Gayla Ann McNeil was born on September 4, 1953, and grew up in Springfield, Ohio. After high school, she joined the U.S. Air Force, but was discharged after it was discovered she was gay. In the fall of 1983, 30-year-old Gayla was living in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and working as a waitress. Unfortunately, she had been committed to the Brevard County Mental Health Facility after she was found standing in the middle of the road telling people she was the female Jesus Christ. After escaping from the facility, her name was placed in a database for law enforcement, but they spelled it wrong. On October 19, 1983, a police officer stopped her for trying to hitchhike in Stuart, Florida. He ran her name, but found no warrants or other information due to the spelling error. At that point, he told her not to hitchhike in Stuart and let her go. The next day, on October 20th, another officer witnessed Gayla hitchhiking on Dixie Highway in Lake Worth. When he stopped her, she was carrying a clear plastic bag with clothes in it and a brown cutting board. She told the officer she was from Cocoa Beach and was headed to Fort Lauderdale. He warned her to be careful because it was in a rough part of town, and then he let her go on her way. If her name had been spelled correctly in the system, he could have saved her from the nightmare she was about to encounter. Around 5 p.m. on Friday, October 21st, 1983, authorities received a call about a body in a canal in western Delray Beach. When investigators arrived, they discovered a female's nude body. She had been stabbed and strangled to death, and an autopsy determined she had also been sexually assaulted. For days later, the remains were identified as belonging to Gayla. Unfortunately, with little to no leads, her murder would go unsolved for the next 40 years. 4 years, serial killer Bobby Joe Long was considered a suspect since he murdered 10 women 3 hours away in Tampa, Florida. However, he never confessed and there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder. In 2000, the DNA from the crime scene was analyzed and entered into CODIS, but no matches were found. In January 2023, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram, who was able to generate an unknown male DNA profile. From there, the genetic genealogy team got to work and provided investigators with some potential leads. Investigators then tracked down those leads and were led to the relative of suspect James Henderson. Henderson worked as a local mechanic, which included working on Florida Power and light trucks. DNA confirmed he was the killer, but unfortunately, he died on November 24, 1987, 4 years after Gayla was murdered. Jasmine Porter grew up on Long Island and went by the nickname Jazzy. Unfortunately, she had some downfalls in her life, but by early 1996, 36-year-old Jazzy was getting her life together. She was 6 months pregnant and living in an apartment in the Bronx with her 4-year-old son, Jeremy. Around this time, she was getting ready to move back to Long Island, but would sadly never get the chance after tragedy struck on the weekend of February 2, 1996. By Monday, February 5th, when her son Jeremy failed to show up to school, some of Jazzy's neighbor friends realized something was wrong and called the police. When the fire department arrived and opened the door, they found her dead in the front bedroom with Jeremy alive next to her. She had sadly been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. Jeremy, thankfully, was unharmed and told investigators he saw a man on top of his mother. While she lay there dead, he tried to clean the blood off her nose and wake her up with an ice cube. Investigators were able to collect DNA from under her fingernails, but at the time, it didn't lead to her killer. Unfortunately, with little to no leads, the case would go unsolved for the next 28 years. In 2021, the New York Police Department's cold case unit had the DNA found under her fingernails retested, and this time they got a match to 66-year-old Greg Fleetwood. Fleetwood was released from prison in August 1994, less than 2 years before Jazzy's murder, after serving 7 years for a manslaughter conviction for killing Linda Miller. He was also accused of sexually assaulting and choking a woman in 1984, but the victim's family convinced her not to testify. After murdering Jazzy, he sexually assaulted another woman in March of 1996, but she died before she could press charges. Another victim surfaced in 2002, but since she was high on drugs, during the attack, she was unable to pick him out of a lineup. On Monday, August 8, 2022, Fleetwood was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for the death of Jazzy. He's currently being held on a $750,000 bond and is due back in court on June 26, 2024. Jeremiah Matthew Watkins was born on August 22, 1972, and grew up in Terra Alta, West Virginia. In November of 1985, 13-year-old Jerry vanished into thin air. For days, search parties scoured the area looking for him. Finally, on November 12, 1985, Jerry's body was found in a shallow hole near some railroad tracks. He had suffered a severe head injury before being stabbed to death. An initial suspect was 18-year-old David Monroe Adams, but he denied involvement and was never charged. Unfortunately, the case would then go unsolved for the next 37 years. In early 2023, a captain at the sheriff's office began re-reviewing the case and noticed some inconsistent statements made by Adams back in 1985. So, he found 56-year-old Adams and began conducting interviews with him. After multiple interviews, he shockingly confessed to the murder. He said they were at his house when they began arguing over a stolen bicycle. During that argument, struck Jerry in the face before dragging him to a shed where he stabbed him to death. Afterward, he put his body in the shallow hole where he was ultimately found. After confessing, Adams was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. However, a grand jury upgraded those charges to first-degree murder. Adams currently remains in a West Virginia jail. Robert Hecht was born on December 27, 1929. In late 1988, 58-year-old Robert was retired from the military, living alone in Punta Gorda, Florida, and had no family in the area. Between November 26th and the 30th, Robert's friend had been unsuccessfully trying to reach him, so they called the police and asked for a welfare check. On November 30th, 1988, at 2:07 a.m., police entered Robert's house and sadly found him dead on the couch. At first, investigators thought he might have fallen and hit his head and then suffered a heart attack. However, an autopsy would show that the head injury was from a blunt object, and they subsequently ruled his death a homicide. Investigators then determined that the murder weapon was large, heavy glass ashtray. They also estimated he was murdered sometime between November 26th and 27th. It was also discovered that Robert's brand new 1989 Lincoln Town car was missing. The car was later found on December 1st, parked on Main Street in Lenoir, North Carolina. It was estimated that the car had been parked there since around November 29th. However, it didn't put them any closer to Robert's killer. At that point, investigators were at a loss until some of his friends reported seeing Robert with a man by the name of Ray. They were seen together at the Oyster Bar in Fisherman's Village on November 26th. One of Robert's friends said the two men were heading to one more bar before heading home. That night, told people he was from Kentucky and Tennessee but had separated from his wife and had a 14-year-old daughter. It is also of note that Robert's friends had never seen Ray before that night. However, they needed more than that to track him down. Thankfully, they found two cigarette butts, one inside Robert's home, near where he was found, and the other in his car. Since Robert didn't smoke, it was likely they belonged to this Ray person. Years later, these cigarette butts would prove vital in solving the case. Over 30 years later, in 2021, the DNA from the cigarettes was analyzed and uploaded to Cody's, but there were no matches. So they enlisted the help of Othram and their genetic genealogy team. From there, investigators were given a potential suspect, a man by the name of Kenneth Ray Miller. They brought in some of Robert's friends, who were shown a photo of Miller, and confirmed he was the man seen with Robert that night. A criminal background check of Miller showed that he had an extensive violent criminal history, which included aggravated battery, burglary, arson, and other crimes. One of Robert's friends had even seen Miller at the home on the morning of the murder, sitting on the end of the same couch where Robert was ultimately found. Unfortunately, he would never be arrested because he died in 2006 at the age of 55 of natural causes. Craig Dwight Williamson was born in 1944 and spent his life as a fisherman and farmer. When he was 46 years old, he met 41-year-old Christine Reinhard, and the two fell quickly in love. Within a month of meeting, they married. Both were interested in fish farming, so they bought a farm in Christine's home state of Wisconsin, where they began raising tilapia. On August 28, 1993, left on a road trip to Colorado Springs to drum up business, but had unfortunately suffered a concussion a few weeks earlier. Christine was incredibly worried about him driving, but there was no way around it. After arriving in Colorado Springs, he drove his bus to a motel and checked in. He then rented a car to drive around the city so he didn't have to drive the bus. That night at 9 p.m. he called Christine and as usual asked her to call him in the morning to wake him up. However, when she called he didn't answer, so she notified the police and reported him missing. After that, someone found his credit cards on a shelf in a grocery store in El Paso, Texas, over 600 miles south of Colorado Springs. 2 weeks later, his rental car was found abandoned in Juarez, Mexico. However, the detective from Colorado found no signs of foul play. Missing, along with Craig, was $2,500 in cash. Christine then decided to go search for him herself. She arrived in Colorado Springs on September 14th and discovered the bus still at the motel, along with his luggage and other belongings. She believed he may have been attacked on the day he vanished, but there was no evidence of a struggle in his hotel room. When the story about his disappearance was featured on the news in both Colorado and Wisconsin, a nurse came forward by the name of Judy Inman and reported seeing a man matching Craig's description traveling on a train from Montana to Washington. She said the man appeared disheveled and was talking about fish tanks. She also believed he said his name was Craig. As a nurse, she felt certain the man was suffering from a head injury. Believing the man might be Craig and that he was in Washington, which is where they originally met, she headed that way. For the next 6 weeks, she visited the locations along the train route, but no signs of him was found. She then met up with Judy on December 26, 1993, and showed her a photo of Craig. Judy said the man on the train closely resembled Craig. She also said she thought he got off in Wishram, Washington. So Craig's son went there and placed missing person flyers, but nothing ever came of it. Investigators began to believe that he was murdered or staged his own disappearance. Christine, on the other hand, believed he was attacked by unknown assailants and they stole his rental car and credit cards. Unfortunately, after his disappearance, Christine was forced to close the fish farm. Craig's disappearance was then aired on Unsolved Mysteries on May 25, 1994, but sadly nothing came of it, at least not yet. When the episode was re-aired in July of 1995, a man living in Key West was shocked when he saw the episode. That man was none other than Craig Williamson. He claimed he had been attacked and robbed while in Colorado and had developed amnesia. The amnesia was worse due to the concussion he suffered a month before his trip. Unfortunately, he couldn't remember much besides the attack and claimed he woke up in the hospital with the name Ron on his wristband. Not knowing who he was, he wandered around the United States before ending up in Key West, where he got a job as a diver. Even though he recognized himself from the episode, he claimed he couldn't remember Christine or his family. Within a few days of the episode re-airing, and Christine were reunited. In an attempt to jog his memory, they traveled to Colorado Springs, but the trip was unsuccessful. Sadly, they decided to divorce but remained friends. He then moved to California while she started a new life in Wyoming. Investigators are still suspicious of his amnesia claims and believe he staged his own disappearance in order to escape the debts and responsibilities of the fish farm. Craig and Christine had used all their savings on the farm and took out a loan in the amount of $400,000. A lot of people believe he married her just to fulfill his dream of becoming a fish farmer, but once the business began failing, he decided to bail. It's also said that Christine and him were far from compatible and were completely two different people. It's thought that added to his decision to walk away. One piece of evidence that does lend credit to the investigators is the beard trimmings found in the rental car. It appeared to them that Craig was trying to alter his appearance, and they didn't feel like someone suffering from amnesia would have done that. Plus, they found it strange that the bus he drove to Colorado had nothing to hold fish such as a cooler, tanks, or fish food. There's also the name Ron on his wristband in the hospital. If that part of the story is true, where did they get the name Ron? When asked what hospital it was and where it was located, he claimed he couldn't remember. As for the sighting of him on the train, it remains unknown if that was really him. One of Craig's children posted online that during his marriage to Christine, he slept on the couch because he was a light sleeper. She also said she was never a huge fan of Christine's. She said she was just happy to have her father back, but said he now suffers from severe headaches and continues to have memory issues. What do y'all think? Did he really have amnesia, or was the whole story made up? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As for Christine, in 1996, after they were divorced, she married Herbert Howells and remained with him until he died in 2019. Laurel Jean Mitchell was born the middle child on May 24, 1958 to parents Dick and Wilma in Whitley County, Indiana. In the late summer of 1975, 17-year-old Laurel was working at Cokesbury Inn, a snack bar at the Epworth Forest Church Camp, and was getting ready to start her senior year at Wallace C. High School. She loved to sing and was a member of the God's Children Choir at Epworth Forest. She had plans to attend business college, but would sadly never get the chance. On Wednesday, August 6, 1975, she left work at 10 p.m. and began walking to Adventureland a mile away to meet up with some friends, but never made it. The last sighting of her was by her friend Scott Pruitt, who saw her walking by the entrance to the Epworth Forest. When Laurel failed to return home that night, her parents called the police at 4:16 a.m. and reported her missing. The next morning at 10:30 a.m. Glenn Dixon and his son were fishing on the Elkhart River in Noble County when they found her body. An autopsy determined she had been sexually assaulted and drowned in the river. On the night she was abducted and murdered, Frank Overmyers and his wife heard a loud car and saw it turn around and stop near their home. He then heard what sounded like the trunk of a car shutting. When he stepped outside, he saw two cars leaving the area. One was a red or orange 1971 Oldsmobile, and the other was a green Mustang. Catherine Flynn, who lived nearby, said she heard several voices say, "Let's get her." The case would then go unsolved for over 40 years, but thankfully they were able to preserve Laurel's clothes and jewelry. Sadly, both her parents passed in 2012 without ever learning who murdered their daughter. With little to no leads in the case, investigators began to believe her murder would never be solved. Even when Indiana State Police Captain Kevin Smith took it on in 2014, people at the department tried to encourage him to let the case go. However, he was certain the case could be solved and proceeded on. While re-interviewing potential witnesses, he learned that a youth singing group known as Celebrate the Sun performed at the Cokesbury in that evening and left around the same time as Laurel. He eventually tracked down the members of the group, but they weren't able to provide any new information. In 2013, Renee Sexton called the Noble Sheriff's Department and said that she went on a date with John Wayne Lehman and they ended up at a party. After the party, while they were driving home, Lehman admitted that he was involved in Laurel's murder along with his friend Fred Bandy Jr. At the time, Renee was 16 and both Lehman and Bandy were either 19 or 20 years old. A year later, on July 3, 2014, Bill McDonald went to the Ligonier Police Department and said that he hung around Fred Bandy Jr. and that he had confessed to murdering Laurel. Then on September 25, 2019, Rick Johnson was interviewed by investigators and said that while at the party with McDonald, Bandy, Lehman, and some others, Bandy once again confessed to the murder and said that he and Lehman were both involved. Investigators were able to determine that Bandy owned a 1971 Oldsmobile at the time of the murder. In order to prove the men were involved, investigators sent Laurel's clothes off for DNA testing and by February 2020, a male DNA profile was generated. They then obtained a DNA sample from Bandy Jr., and it matched the DNA found on Laurel's clothes. On Monday, February 6, 2023, investigators arrested Bandy Jr. and Lehman and charged them with Laurel's murder. At the time of Bandy's arrest, he was on the sex offender registry for sex crimes against a minor. Lehman, on the other hand, had no criminal record. It will be interesting to see if Lehman is convicted since there is no DNA evidence against him. However, as of 2024, both men are awaiting trial. Lucille Minor Johnson was born on July 11, 1912 in Eureka, Utah. She graduated from the LDS Business College and then married Howard Johnson in 1933. Sadly, Howard passed away on August 5, 1989. In early 1991, 78-year-old Lucille was a mother, grandmother, and widow living in Holiday, Utah. She was also the president of Southern Utah Broadcasting and the president of a family investment real estate group called Investment Center. On February 2, 1991, her daughter Shirley England came by her mother's house and made a horrific discovery. Lucille was found lying in her bed, beaten and strangled to death. When investigators arrived, they found Lego bricks on the living room floor. This was strange because her family said she was meticulous with keeping her house tidy and said she would have never left toys out unless her grandchildren were there, which they had not been. Interestingly, Lucille was known for wearing a ring and necklace, but those items were nowhere to be found. Investigators worked on the case for years, but stopped in 2006 when all leads ran out. In August 2013, the case was reopened, and DNA evidence collected under Lucille's fingernails was uploaded to Cody's and linked to John Edward Sansing, who was already in prison for murder in an unrelated case. Investigators then sought out Sansing's son, who was 5 years old at the time of the murder, and confirmed his fingerprints matched those found on the Lego bricks. This means that at least one son was in the home when he murdered Lucille, but they would later learn the entire family was actually there. Sansing's nephew, Chad, then came forward and told about an argument he overheard between Sansing and his wife. During the argument, Sansing's wife threatened to tell the police that he had murdered a lady in Utah. In 2018, Sansing revealed how he met Lucille. He said she brought her car in for service where he worked and had to leave it, so he gave her a ride back to her house. During the drive, he noticed she had on jewelry, which he figured he could sell for drug money, so he made a plan to come back and rob her. However, he didn't rob her on that day. Instead, he waited until February 2nd, found her phone number in the phone book, and called her. He said he was in the neighborhood with his family and that he was going to drop by. When he knocked on the door, she let him in and his family, including his wife, Kara, inside. Once inside, he asked to use the restroom, but instead began going through her rooms, looking for something to steal. However, she caught him in the act, so he murdered her. 4 years after the murder, he moved from Utah to Arizona, where he remained until he was arrested for the murder of Trudy Calabrese in 1998. Trudy's murder occurred on February 24, 1998, when Sansing called the Living Spring Assembly of God Church and requested food for him and his family. Trudy, a social worker who worked for the church, showed up with 2 boxes of food a little after 4 p.m., unaware that she was walking into a nightmare. Sansing had a drug addiction and planned to rob Trudy when she arrived, even informing his wife Kara of his plans. Once inside, Sansing, high on drugs, tied her up with the help of Kara and proceeded to beat and sexually assault her. Afterward, he stabbed her to death, all while his kids and wife were in the next room. He then left her body in the bedroom and joined his wife back in the living room where they slept for the night. He then woke up in the middle of the night and moved Trudy's body to the backyard under some clothes. In the end, Sansing only netted $1.25 from Trudy. In 1999, he pleaded guilty to all the charges and was sentenced to death. As for his wife, Kara, she was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. In Lucille's case, Sansing pleaded guilty and was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of April 2024, John Sansing remains on death row and Kara Sansing remains in prison. Marion Crofts was born in 1967 to Trevor and Ann was the youngest of 2 siblings. On Saturday, June 6, 1981, 14-year-old Marion left her home in Fleet, Hampshire to ride the 4 miles on her bicycle to the Wavell School in Farnborough for band practice. Typically, her father would drive her, but on this particular day he was playing in a cricket match. Unfortunately, she would never arrive and was never seen alive again. Between 9:30 and 10 a.m., as she was passing Logan's Road and Outershot alongside the Basingstoke Canal, someone attacked her and dragged her into the woods where she was sexually assaulted and beaten to death. After being reported missing, a police dog discovered her body later that day hidden in some undergrowth. Her clarinet was also discovered in the canal. Thankfully, investigators were able to collect evidence that would be used years later for DNA testing. Over the course of the investigation, Hampshire police said they questioned over 24,000 potential suspects, but everyone led to a dead end. Unbeknownst to them, one of those potential suspects was the actual killer. In 1999, a DNA profile was generated, but it didn't match to anyone in the UK DNA database. For the next 2 years, they continued checking, and finally in 2001, thanks to a rule that required criminals to submit their DNA, a suspect by the name of Tony Jasinski was found. They got his DNA sample after he was arrested for assaulting his wife. After being added to the DNA database, it matched the DNA found on Marion. He was then subsequently arrested and charged with the sexual assault and murder of Marion. When his co-workers found out, they were shocked and described him as the nicest guy they could ever meet. They also said he would do anything to help anybody. At the time of the murder, 29-year-old Tony was a lance corporal in the Armed Catering Corps based in Aldershot. In 1976, he married Leanne Gowans, and the two were living about 1.5 miles from the crime scene. She was also pregnant at the time. In the end, a Winchester Crown Court jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. In 2014, he appealed the sentence, arguing that the DNA evidence showed that the murderer had a chromosome disorder and that it couldn't have been him. The judge in the case denied the appeal, referencing the fact that the DNA match was 1 in a billion. As for his wife, she called him a psychopath and said he deserved the prison sentence. Natasha Alexandra August Carter was born on December 22, 1989, and went by the nickname Alex. In August of 2000, 10-year-old Alex was living with her mother, 41-year-old Susan Gale Carter, and her stepfather Larry Webb. Unfortunately, Alex's parents were going through a contentious custody dispute, and on August 8, 2000, Susan and Alex strangely disappeared. Believing she kidnapped Alex, a felony warrant for kidnapping was issued. However, they were not able to track Susan or Alex down, and neither were ever seen alive again. Their disappearance was even more concerning because Alex's grandmother said her granddaughter was terrified of her mother and did not want to live with her. Unfortunately, the case would go unsolved for over 20 years. In 2021, the case was reopened. And in 2022 and 2023, investigators searched Larry's home in Beckley for clues. While there, they found a bullet in a bedroom wall and took some floor towels from the basement. When he was questioned, he said he had dementia and couldn't remember what happened to them. However, forensic testing on the bullet would prove otherwise. All these years later, the bullet still had traces of Alex's DNA on it. In October of 2023, Larry was indicted. However, due to Larry's declining health, he was held in a medical facility from 2023 until April 12, 2024, when he was finally taken into custody. He then confessed to the murders and told investigators where to find the bodies. He said he murdered Susan because money had gone missing and he believed she was spending a lot of it. This led to an argument between them and ended with him shooting her. He then shot and killed Alex to avoid being caught for Susan's murder. After both were dead, he stored the bodies in his basement before burying them in a shallow grave on his property. On April 22, 2024, investigators dug up a spot at Larry's home and found their bodies. That same day, Larry suffered a medical episode and was rushed to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Brandon Michael Chiklis was born on July 24, 1997 in Lowell, Massachusetts to Paul Chiklis and Tricia. He was described as a trustworthy and loyal individual with a heart of gold. He was a member of the ROTC at the Monty Tech High School and graduated in 2015. He enjoyed the outdoors and spent 10 years as a member of the Boy Scouts, achieving the rank of Life Scout with Troop 41 in Fitchburg. While in high school, he met and later began dating Julia Enright, a small-town girl with a desire to become a doctor. By the age of 20, Brandon was working at a local HVAC company. Then on June 23, 2018, he left Westminster, Massachusetts to visit his father in Windham, New Hampshire, but strangely never arrived. By the next day, when there was still no sign of him, his family reported him missing. A week later, his 2010 gray Honda Civic was found in the parking lot of a Hannaford supermarket in Ring, New Hampshire, with the keys inside and the doors unlocked. Then, over 2 weeks later, on July 10, 2018, his body was found by a jogger about 6 miles from where his car had been found. His remains were wrapped in a blanket and 2 dark trash bags that were duct-taped. The medical examiner used dental records to identify him and found numerous stab wounds on his body, ruling his death a homicide. State police detectives obtained call detail records for his cell phone, and it placed him at the Enright's home in Ashburnham from 11:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. on June 23, 2018, and that's where his phone activity ceased. Investigators then asked Julia to come in for questioning, which she did on July 13, 2018. While there, police seized her car after Trooper Sean Murphy said he walked around the Prius looking for any dents or damage and saw dark stains on the floor mat behind the driver's seat that he believed could be blood. A briefcase or computer bag was also seen in the back seat. Police later obtained a search warrant for the vehicle. Samples of the stains were sent for testing and positively identified as blood. The samples were then sent for DNA testing and matched Brandon's DNA. They then got a search warrant for the Enright home, and what they found shocked everyone. Inside a treehouse on the property were numerous documents, notebooks, and business cards that showed Julia was a dominatrix who was paid by men to participate in activities related to BDSM. The treehouse had even been fitted with restraints. They also strangely found a new rug in the treehouse. When it was removed, they found blood that had seeped down through the floorboards. There was also blood on the stairs and under the treehouse. During questioning by the police, Julia initially provided varying accounts of what had occurred on the day in question, before finally admitting that Brandon had been to her house on the day he disappeared. She said they smoked cannabis and drank alcohol before being intimate in his car. When asked about the treehouse, she said she had brought friends there in the past, but denied being in there that day with Brandon. She claimed that Brandon left to buy drugs and never returned. However, the blood from the treehouse, just like her Prius, belonged to Brandon. Investigators determined that she had lured Brandon to the property with the promise of a hookup, but instead killed him to please her lover, Jonathan Linda. She was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her boyfriend, Linda, was also arrested. Investigators would eventually learn that she had restrained Brandon in the treehouse with the new restraints and then stabbed him to death. Turns out that Julia had an obsession with dead things and even collected roadkill to make ball art. This is also why she wanted to become a doctor, because she loved human anatomy. They also found journal entries where she said she fantasized about killing people. There was also a note that indicated that she wanted to cure the world of overpopulation. Julia was asked about the notes and acknowledged writing them, but claimed they were for a creative writing class. Also written in her diary, she explained how she intentionally got pregnant to go to Planned Parenthood to try to steal or bribe an employee for a fetus specimen for her collection. At trial, her boyfriend, Jonathan Lind, testified that they would cut each other and spread blood over their bodies during sex. He said the treehouse had to be cleaned and the carpet replaced because he defecated on the floor during one of their encounters. Surveillance footage captured Julia at a Home Depot store buying carpet on June 26, 2018. In the end, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole after 25 years. At John Len's trial, Brandon's mother testified that Len could have revealed the location of Brandon's remains during those 17 days he was missing and argued he should receive the maximum perjury sentence of 20 years. However, in February 2025, he was sentenced to only 7 to 9 years in prison. Catherine Blackburn, who went by Kate, was born on March 1, 1914, in Albany, New York. In 1938, she married Jesse Blackburn, Jr., who went by Jess. They never had children together, and in 1964 they separated. So Kate, now living alone, decided to rent out a room in the upstairs apartment in her home. She placed ads in the newspaper and painted the rental unit. That weekend, as she finished the painting job, she began showing the property to potential renters. However, one of those potential renters only had evil intentions. On September 13th, 1964, after a few days of no word from Kate, her family became concerned. The last time anyone had spoken to her was a few days earlier when she hurriedly got off the phone with her sister when a potential tenant arrived. That morning, a coworker of Catherine's attempted to pick her up to go to work. But when Kate didn't come to the door, she contacted Kate's niece, 19-year-old Sandy Carmichael, to try to figure out what was going on. Sandy and Kate's sister entered the home and made a terrifying discovery. Kate had been dead alone in the house for several days, and it looked like a horror scene from a movie. Kate was struck in the back of the head and stabbed in the neck, then sexually assaulted while she was unconscious before the killer heated up 3 knives on her gas stove and burned shapes onto her skin. Even though this was years before DNA technology, investigators still collected blood samples, a footprint in the yard, and slips of paper believed to be connected to the killer. Investigators learned that Kate had recently canceled newspaper ads to rent out the room and painted the rental unit the same weekend she was killed. Investigators found a slip of paper with the same numbers as the house, 117, and a receipt torn from Kate's receipt book. Investigators were able to read the name on the missing receipt by examining pen impressions on the next sheet of paper in the book. That name did not lead to any known person and was determined to likely be fictitious. They also looked into a famous killer such as the Boston Strangler, but none turned out to be the killer. The case would go cold for decades until 2023, when DNA evidence from the attack and sexual assault was submitted to Othram to determine if advanced DNA testing could aid in identifying the suspect. From there, genealogists provided the name Joseph Nowakowski to investigators. Since he had died in 1998, investigators had his body exhumed from the Albany Rural Cemetery. His DNA was then compared with the DNA from the crime scene, and it was a match. Nowakowski was born in 1931 and was convicted of a similar assault of an elderly woman in Schenectady, New York in 1973. He was 33 at the time of Kate's murder and was in and out of prison most of his adult life until his death. In fact, he was released from state prison in 1980 and lived under the radar for 20 more years. There is no indication that he and Kate knew each other, and Nowakowski was not a suspect in the 1964 investigation. Investigators are now looking into other crimes that Nowakowski could be connected to. Deidre Christine Harm was born on November 16, 1984, in Woodstock, Illinois to parents Scott and Gail Itzen. At the age of 22, she lived in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, and was the mother of a 4-month-old baby daughter named Vegas. On June 10, 2006, Deidre left her daughter Vegas with a babysitter and then went out for the night. She started at the Finish Line bar before going to the New Body Shop Tavern a block away. After that, she was never seen alive again. The next day, when neither her family nor the babysitter could get in touch with her, they reported her missing. Months went by with no answers. Then in November 2006, her remains were found in a wooded area known as Blueberry Ridge, which is about 5 miles from the downtown area. Her cause of death has never been publicly released. Her murder would then go unsolved for the next 19 years. The night she was murdered, witnesses said they saw a man hanging around Deidre at the downtown bars. While they couldn't identify him at the time, in 2009, they got a big break when he was arrested and his DNA tied him to the crime. The man was Christopher Rivik, and one of the witnesses identified him as the man seen around Deidre that night. Rivik's 2009 arrest was for the murder of Renee Williams. However, he would never stand trial because he took his own life in jail a day after being arrested. Investigators then spoke to Rivik's wife, Johanna, and she confirmed they had been in Wisconsin around the time of the murder, visiting family. She said when he showed back up at the house that night, he had muddy clothes and mud on his truck. When asked where he had been, he said the Blueberry Ridge area, the same location as Deidre's remains. 2 of Rivik's high school friends told detectives that when they were younger, they often used the area to drink so they wouldn't be busted by cops. The day after Deidre vanished, Johanna said he asked her to cut his hair. She also caught him deleting photos from his phone, and then he strangely tried to recreate them with the same clothes. As for the murder of Renee Williams, Johanna told police that Rivik admitted to the murder and even asked her for help in moving her body, threatening to kill her if she refused. He murdered her after picking her up and propositioning her with a threesome, which she refused. This angered him and he strangled her to death. He's also a suspect in the disappearance of KIMT morning anchor Jody Hughes and Trout. She vanished around 4 a.m. on June 27, 1995, after calling a colleague to say she was on her way to the office. After her disappearance, investigators found evidence of a struggle outside her apartment, including a pair of high heels and a bent car key. Sadly, she has never been found, and in 2001, she was declared legally dead. Revax's girlfriend had lived near Jody, and it's suspected that he attacked and kidnapped her outside her home as she was leaving to go to work. While justice can never be served, the district attorney confirmed that if Revac were still alive, he would most certainly be charged with Deidre's murder. Robin, or Lawrence, was born on November 25, 1956 and married Ollie Lawrence on New Year's Eve, 1989. 3 years later, they welcomed their daughter, Nicole. Sadly, Nicole had to quickly undergo a liver transplant after birth, but she persevered with her parents by her side and daily immunosuppressants she would have to take for the rest of her life. They lived in Springfield, Virginia, where Robin worked in the advertising industry and Ollie was an airline executive. In Robin's spare time, she took ballet classes and was described as a personable, fun-loving individual. She had earned a degree in fine art from Carnegie Mellon University and was then selected to design the first medal for the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, which was awarded to Rosa Parks. However, on November 20, 1994, their worlds came crashing down. When Robin's friend Lori found Robin stabbed to death in her home and 2-year-old Nicole wandering around scared, alone, and hungry, Lori called 911 and rushed Nicole to the hospital because she wasn't sure how long it had been since she took her daily medication. Unfortunately, Ollie was out of town for the weekend. Back at the scene, investigators determined that a struggle had occurred and due to all the defensive wounds, it was apparent Robin had tried to fight off her attacker. Her killer had also cut the phone cord to the phone that was found next to her. Investigators determined that the suspect entered through a window off the back deck, the same one Lori used to gain entry to the home. As for a time frame, it was estimated that she had been murdered 2 days prior to being found, and 2-year-old Nicole roamed the house all alone. During that time, she had tried to use tissues to clean the blood off her mother and had brought all of her empty baby bottles and laid them next to her. Everyone was at a loss as to who could have committed this heinous crime. Robbery didn't appear to be the motive because the cash and jewelry in the bedroom were all left behind. To investigators, this meant that she was likely the target and killed by someone she knew. Ollie was questioned, and while he was cooperative, investigators learned some damning information. He had been having an affair with a colleague. This immediately shot him to the top of the suspect list. However, the business trip had been to the Bahamas, and it would have been impossible for him to commit the crime. Investigators even flew to the Bahamas to confirm his alibi. Detectives also interviewed Ali's lover, but found no evidence she was involved. As Robin's family mourned her death, investigators pieced together a timeline and determined that the last time anyone had heard from Robin was around 6 p.m. on Friday, November 18th, and they believe she was killed around 9:30-ish, with her body being discovered 2 days later. Investigators had little else to go on, since no fingerprints were found at the scene, but there was one thing that caught their eye. On the towel rod next to the sliding tub door was a washcloth, and he noticed a small dark stain on it. That stain turned out to be blood, and authorities extracted DNA from it. Multiple people close to the family, including Ollie, were tested, but no one matched. The DNA was then uploaded to Cody's, but with no matches there either, the case stalled. Decades later, in 2019, investigators enlisted the help of Parabon Nanolabs. Their analysis showed Robin's killer likely had European ancestry, but tracing him through his relatives proved nearly impossible, as they were all so distantly related. That's when an amateur genealogist named Liz, who was also a volunteer with the police department, agreed to take on the case. Liz was given information on the killer's ethnicity, which included Irish, and was also given a list of over 1,000 fourth and fifth cousins who shared his DNA. In 2021, Parban was asked to create a phenotyping sketch of Robin's killer. It was determined that the man likely had fair to very fair skin color, dark blue eyes, and a larger-than-average chin. However, no one in Robin's family recognized the person, including Ollie. She eventually traced the man's ancestors to Canada. She continued to piece together the family tree and was eventually led to a man named Stephen Smirk. She provided the name to investigators who began looking into him, and soon discovered that he was a computer programmer in Niskayuna, New York, married to a defense attorney with 2 high school-age children, a nice house in the suburbs, and no more than a speeding ticket on his record. They were starting to think he may not be their guy until they found his yearbook photo that showed him at the age of 16, and it looked very similar to the phenotyping sketch. Smirk, now 52 years old, was visited at his home by investigators, who were hoping he would willingly provide them a sample of his DNA. And that's exactly what he did, even after they told him they were there from Virginia to talk about Robin Lawrence. During the visit, he strangely showed no expression, and investigators said his demeanor was very unusual. After collecting his DNA, investigators checked into their hotel, and not long after, they received a very unexpected call. It was Smirk, and he was ready to confess. He said he had gone to the Niskayuna Police Department to turn himself in, but the doors were locked. So the detective told him to call 911, which he did. On September 7, 2023, after he was taken into custody, Smirk began his confession. He first asked them to remind him of her name. He said he remembered she was black, but couldn't remember anything else. He said he was a serial killer and that the murder of Robin was intentional, and his only victim. However, investigators were skeptical of that claim. He told them that in November 1994, he was a 22-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, and on the night of the murder, he had been drinking beer and taking ephedrine pills, which is a strong stimulant. He said something inside him had just always known that he was going to kill somebody someday, but he just didn't know who. He said it was hard to explain, but it was like an overbearing thought in his brain that he just had to do it. Smirk said he drove to Robin's neighborhood because he was familiar with the area, having visited friends who stayed in a house nearby. He said he didn't know her or even know who lived there. He confirmed he entered the house from the back deck and told detectives he was wearing a ski mask and leather gloves. He said he went in and noticed that she had a baby in one of the rooms, and then proceeded down the hall to Robin's bedroom. He said he used all his military training, including hand-to-hand combat, to murder her. He said he's highly influenced by demons, and one of the reasons he enlisted in the military was because he wanted to kill. He said his wife and kids were the only reason he never killed again. They then asked him about the washcloth in the bathroom with his blood stain on it. He said Robin had clawed his face and he still had small scars from it, which he showed the detectives. At the end of the interview, Smirk was asked if he wanted to express any remorse to Robin's family. He declined, saying he didn't feel anything for the family and didn't even feel bad about what he had done. He was then placed under arrest and charged with Robin's murder. A week later, DNA testing confirmed that Smirk's DNA matched the blood found on the washcloth. On April 15, 2024, a grand jury indicted him, but he would never go to trial because 6 months later, he took a plea deal for first-degree murder. Smirk had been diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, which he constantly fed with ephedra and alcohol. In 2004, ephedra was banned by the FDA because when it was mixed with other substances, it could trigger dangerous psychiatric side effects. By the time Smirk was arrested, he had already sought help for his mental health problems and had become sober, but there was still no remorse. And in the end, he was sentenced to 70 years in prison with the possibility of parole. Sydney Irene Loof was born on August 21, 1993 in Broken Bow, Nebraska to parents George and Susie. At the age of 7, she and her family moved from Arcadia, Nebraska to Neely, Nebraska. Sydney was described as a caring individual with a loving and kind heart, who was also very passionate about animals. After graduating from Neely Oakdale High School in 2011, she moved to Lincoln and began working at Minutes, a home improvement store on North 27th Street. In her free time, she enjoyed fishing and golfing and spoiled her beloved cat. Memsey. Unfortunately, Sydney struggled with anxiety and depression, and by 2017, her struggles with her mental health had taken a toll on her. She was now calling in sick because the depression was so debilitating. Unsure what to do, she called and confided in her family, who in turn helped her schedule a doctor's appointment. Sadly, that was the last conversation they ever had together. Not long after, she decided to meet up with a woman she met on Tinder. Unbeknownst to Sydney, the woman who was using the alias Audrey had nothing but evil intentions planned. Her real name was Bailey Boswell, and she had a boyfriend named Aubrey Trail. Together, they devised a diabolical plan to murder Sydney. Their first date occurred on November 14, 2017 at Boswell's apartment in Wilbur, about 40 miles south of Lincoln. The date was held in the basement apartment that Boswell and Aubrey had been renting for the past 6 months. The date went fine, and they made plans for the following day, with Sydney confirming twice that she and Boswell would be the only ones at the second date. Sydney was clearly excited and had even posted on Snapchat the caption that read, "Ready for my date." Cell tower data showed Boswell traveling from Sydney's rental home to Wilbur. Meanwhile, Trail was back at his and Boswell's basement apartment, putting up plastic tarps and tents. The last communication from Sydney's phone was at 8:32 that night. After leaving with Boswell, she was never seen alive again. The next day, she failed to show up for work and never called to inform them. Concerned, co-workers went to her home to check on her, but there was no answer at the door. Her mother, Susie, also tried texting and calling, but received no answer. She was unaware of Sydney's plans and reported her missing the following day. Investigators checked her rental home and found all the lights on, her car in the driveway, and her purse still on the kitchen counter. What immediately concerned them was that Sydney's cat had no food or water, something she would have never let happen. After investigators learned about Sydney's date from Tinder, they contacted Tinder, and that's how they learned about Bailey Boswell. Once they began looking into her, they also learned about her boyfriend Aubrey. The two were questioned, and while Boswell admitted to the date, she said she had dropped Sydney off at a friend's house afterward and never heard from her again. However, days later, the landlord began complaining about a strong smell of bleach coming from the basement apartment. Police went to the apartment and knocked on the door, but no one answered. Using a key from the landlord, they entered and were immediately hit with the smell of bleach. They also found the AC running even though it was only in the mid-50s outside. On November 28th, Boswell and Trail were publicly named persons of interest. Once they discovered this, they started a Facebook live stream and began defending themselves, saying the first date involved her and Sydney driving the car around and smoking cannabis. She continued lying, saying she dropped Sydney off at a friend's home after the second date. By the 30th, police set out to arrest them on fraud charges and located them at a motel in Branson, Missouri. In their possessions were maps, sleeping bags, and hiking shoes, along with a plan to escape to Mexico. However, there was still no sign of Sydney. 3 weeks later, over a 48-hour period, Sydney's remains were found scattered in ditches along a state highway about 60 miles from where she was murdered. They also found sex toys and other items wrapped inside multiple 30-gallon black trash bags that were left alongside a gravel road north of Edgar, Nebraska, about an hour west of Wilbur. After the gruesome discovery, Trail shockingly confessed, but claimed he acted alone. Boswell agreed and maintained her innocence. However, evidence would prove otherwise when store receipts and video footage showed the couple purchasing bleach, saws, and trash bags shortly before the murder. Cameras also recorded them checking into a Best Western hotel together in Lincoln near the Minot store where Sydney was employed. Then cell tower data from their cell phones showed them waiting near Sydney's home before she left for work, and then it showed them following behind her to Minot's. Trolley then went inside and purchased an air freshener, cotton cord, Drano, protein bars, a thermometer, and lighters. The next day, they went to the Aardvark Antique Mall and bought a folding saw and a food grinder. They were also caught at a Dollar General buying the 30-gallon trash bags and 2 gallons of Clorox bleach. These last items were bought mere hours before the second date with Sydney. The tools used to dismember Sydney have never been located. At some point, Trail tried to change his confession, telling the FBI that his job was to make movies for special kinds of kinks. He said he was paid by people who wanted to see these movies, and he used their money to pay people such as Sydney. However, no proof of this was ever found. Investigators then received some very damning information. After Boswell and Trell were arrested, 3 women came forward and said they met Boswell on Tinder and were introduced to Trell. They spoke about the couple's desires to record victims as they tortured and killed them and said they planned to sell the videos. Trell told them he thought he could get $1 million for one of them. While in jail, the couple communicated via coded letters in order to get their stories straight, but those ciphers were easily decoded. During the trial, Trell, who was in a wheelchair, shocked the courtroom when he shouted out, "Bailey is innocent and I curse you all." He then attempted to slash his own neck with a smuggled razor fragment. He was rushed to the hospital and found to have only superficial wounds. In the end, both were found guilty of first-degree murder. Was also found guilty of criminal conspiracy to commit murder. A 3-judge panel then unanimously agreed to sentence Trell to death while Boswell was given life in prison. They were also found guilty and sentenced for defrauding hundreds of thousands of dollars from interstate coin buyers. So what turned this couple into murderers? During the trial, they discussed their childhoods. Boswell was raised in Leon, Iowa, where as an infant, her father was murdered. She excelled at school athletics, topping the list of fastest runners on her relay team and scoring dozens of points in basketball games. She was even offered a scholarship to play college basketball. However, she threw it all away due to drug abuse. She then had 1 daughter and married a man named Freddie Pinnell, who was allegedly physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive. He was also an addict, which resulted in them losing custody of their child. At some point, Boswell went on to the now-defunct sex marketplace, Backpage, alleging that she was looking for a sugar daddy, and that's where she met Trell. His childhood was worse than Boswell's. He was abused by his parents at the age of 2 before his grandfather took him in. However, he eventually returned to living with his mother, and while there he was abused by his stepfather. He was eventually placed in foster care where he moved from one home to the next. He eventually ended up in a juvenile facility before landing himself in prison in Tennessee at the age of 17 after he robbed a motel at gunpoint. Thankfully, Boswell and Trolley will spend the rest of their lives behind bars and can never hurt another innocent person again. In 2005, Michalina Lewandowska met and fell in love with Marcin Kasperzak. The couple got engaged a year later and moved from Poland to England. In 2008, Michalina got pregnant and soon after, relationship began to crumble. She would end up giving birth to a son named Jacob. Meanwhile, the couple caught off their engagement, but they remained together and Michalina continued to wear her ring, in hopes that things would eventually work themselves out. By 2011, things had only gotten worse, and it was clear that Marcin was not interested in mending their broken relationship. So, Michalina told him she was unhappy and wanted to return to Poland with their 3-year-old son. On Saturday, May 28, 2011, Marcin invited Michalina to go shopping with him and his friend, 18-year-old Patrick Boris. Although this was unusual because he never wanted to spend time with Miss Shalina, the thought of hanging out with him made her happy because she ultimately wanted to keep her family together. She also loved and trusted him and hoped that maybe he had a change of heart and had decided to treat her better. Jacob was spending the day with his grandmother, Marcin's mother. As Miss Shalina exited the bathroom after getting ready, Marcin and Patrick were sitting there staring back at her, with eerie smiles plastered across their faces. Marcin grabbed Michalina's arm and said he wanted to show her something. He pulled a 300,000-volt stun gun from his pocket, pressed it against her neck and tasered her. As she fell on the floor, Marcin put his knees on her chest and held her down. Marcin yelled at Patrick to get the packing tape. They then gagged Michalina, bound her wrists and ankles, and taped her mouth shut. They left her tied up, slumped against a wall, and tasered her once again. A few hours later, they dragged her into the kitchen and put her inside a cardboard box. As Marcin began to tape the box shut, with her inside, she screamed for him to let her go. Marcin knelt down, laughed, and said, "I've hated you for 4 years. You'll never see your son again." They put the cardboard box in the trunk of Patrick's car and drove to a wooded area near Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. They placed the box into a shallow, pre-dug grave and put an 88-pound log on top of her. As she lay in the box, terrified, Michalina could hear the sound of dirt being shoveled on top of her. Then, after a while, the noises stopped. Feeling she would suffocate, Michalina began thinking of her son and started taking shallow breaths, trying to keep conscious. She used the sharp edges of her engagement ring to cut the tape off her mouth, legs, and wrist. She slashed away at the cardboard until she was able to make a hole. She put her fingers through the hole and tore away at the cardboard, but all she felt was soil. The soil began to collapse into the box, covering Michalina's face, hair, and clothes. She screamed for help, but no one was around to hear her. She was weak, and her entire body throbbed with pain, but she knew she had to keep fighting if she wanted to see her son again. Michalina continued to slash, kick, and tear at the box until she was able to stick an arm out, then her head, and then her entire body. After an hour inside the box, Michalina miraculously freed herself. She ran into the road and caught a motorist's attention who phoned the police. 15 minutes later, authorities arrived and Miss Helena showed them the cardboard box in which she had been buried alive. Marson was shocked when authorities knocked on his door and told him he was under arrest for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Miss Helena. While searching the home they shared, authorities found several chemicals and instructions for homemade explosives. Authorities later discovered that after burying Miss Helena alive, the two men withdrew money from an ATM using her bank card. Marston claims that he only intended to scare Michalina and didn't actually have plans to kill her. However, the court wasn't buying it and he was convicted of attempted murder and kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Patrick was also found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years. To this day, Michalina has nightmares that Marston will come back to find her and kill her. With no family in the UK to help her, Michalina was thankful for all the care she received from the police and staff of West Yorkshire Police. Gina Renee Hall was born on August 24, 1961 and grew up in Coburn, Virginia with her 3 siblings, stepmother and father. Gina was loved by many for her happy disposition. She loved to dance and even helped teach children's dance classes. She was voted most popular in her senior class at Coburn High School, where she was the lead percussionist in the school's marching band. She graduated from Coburn High in 1979 and enrolled in Emory and Henry College the following fall before transferring to Radford University in the spring of 1980. In 1980, 18-year-old Gina was a freshman living with her sister Delana, who was also a graduate student at the university. Gina was described as a friendly, soft-spoken, and all-around amazing young woman with many goals in life. Gina had just finished her exams on June 28, 1980, and later that night, left home at around 10 p.m. to meet friends at the Blacksburg Marriott Lounge in Blacksburg, Virginia, and arrived around 11 p.m. Within half an hour of Gina's arrival, witnesses saw a man harassing and bothering Gina. 2 older women tried to intervene and assist Gina after she sought refuge at their table. The man was later identified as 28-year-old Stephen Madison Epperly and was not someone that Gina knew. Epperly played football for Virginia Tech for 1 season before becoming a high school substitute teacher. Before the women left, Gina convinced them that she would be okay and then was seen leaving the gathering at about midnight, followed by Epperly and his best friend, likely unknowingly. The 2 men would later try to convince others that she willingly went with Epperly, but those close to her knew better. Her friends and family stated that she would have never voluntarily left with any man or anyone she didn't fully trust or know well, and certainly not a character 10 years her senior such as Epperly. Rumors spread that she had been dancing with Epperly that night when the truth was that she danced with someone else instead. After leaving the Blacksburg Marriott Lounge, Gina was never seen again. Later in the week, when the news announced Gina's disappearance, the 2 women who assisted Gina that night reported the harassment incident to the local police, but that information became buried in the case file. The car Gina was driving that night was seen at a 3-story lake house at Clater Lake, 20 miles from Blacksburg. Come to find out, the home was owned by Epperly's friend's parents, who were out of town for the weekend, The friend was Bill King, and he allegedly gave Epperly the keys to the house that night in the parking lot as he was leaving the Marriott lounge. Once there, made one last phone call to her sister that night. Her sister would report that Gina sounded nervous in her short, out-of-character conversation. She told her sister she was looking at a lake as if Gina did not know where she was, but wanted her sister to know she could see a lake. Her sister Delana said she encouraged her sister to come on home, but Gina didn't respond to that other than getting in one last word before the call went dead. Her last word was Steve, which her sister believes was Gina's attempt at identifying her abductor. After that night, Gina was never seen alive again. According to Epperly's friend, Epperly left the lake house a few hours later at about 4:30 or 5 in the morning. He didn't own a car and left in the 1975 Chevrolet Monte Carlo that Gina had borrowed from her sister that night. Before he left the lake house, neighbor witnesses would later report hearing gunshots and vehicles coming and going during the early morning hours. By noon on Monday, Gina's car was found by Craig Runyon and Robert Lent, friends of Delana, helping her search for her sister. The car was located close to a railroad trestle over the New River on Hazel Hollow Road in Radford. The car's trunk was open, the seat was pushed all the way back, and the inside of the driver's door handle strap was broken, almost as if it was damaged by Gina trying to keep someone from getting in the car. The seat being pushed back was unusual because Gina was a petite girl and always had the seat pushed up all the way to the front. Found inside the trunk was hair and blood evidence, which matched Gina's O-positive blood type. Furthermore, various items like towels and cleaning supplies were missing from the lake house. There at the lake house, police found evidence of a cleanup attempt, with blood stains and blood splatter found both inside and outside the home. There were cattail seeds on the front grille of the car and mud on the left side tires, as if the car had pulled over in a ditch or an area common for cattail seeds. Inside the car was trash from a fast food restaurant which Gina was known to not eat. There was also an orange cup with the Tennessee Volunteers football logo on it and an ashtray full of cigarettes. Gina didn't smoke, and interestingly neither did Epperly. One of her shoes was found on the other end of the railroad trestle, and about 2 weeks later, Gina's blood-stained clothes were found bundled up neatly, as if placed in the woods across the trestle from where the car was located. Also, a blue towel from the lake house was found in the same area and had been used to clean up the blood-stained carpet. The blood found on the towel was human and was the same type as Gina's. The synthetic carpet fibers found on the towel that matched the blood-stained carpet in the lake house also matched the carpet fibers found on the trunk's carpet. Finally, Gina's clothing also had similar carpet fibers on them. When Epperly was questioned, he claimed that Gina voluntarily left the Marriott with him in her sister's car to go to his friend's lake house. He said once there, she called her sister. Epperly said that Gina refused to have sex with him, then decided to leave, so she dropped him off at his place at 4 a.m. in Radford. Epperly claimed he went to sleep after that and never saw Gina again. A murder weapon was never found, but the investigators believed that Epperly might have killed Gina after she refused to sexual advances. Rumors began to spread around town about Gina's disappearance, including talk of murder and her being buried somewhere around the Deadman Center in Radford, where construction was underway at the time. Pulaski County Commonwealth's attorney Everett Shockley was persistent in getting justice for Gina despite many of his peers, and even a judge in the area advising him not to press charges against Epperly until the body was found. It wouldn't be long before Epperly's violent past revealed that he was not the all-American boy many believed he was. In fact, in 1976, 4 years before Gina's murder, Epperly faced 2 charges of rape. A judge dismissed one for difference in opinion, and in the second he was found not guilty thanks to his high-dollar defense attorney. Epperly was ultimately indicted for Gina's murder, but was convinced it was impossible to be found guilty without a body. However, during the trial, Attorney Shockley called 31 witnesses and presented over 90 pieces of forensic evidence. One of the most compelling witnesses was retired Pennsylvania State Trooper John Preston and his tracking dog. The German Shepherd named Harris II was given a piece of Epperly's clothing and followed the scent trail over the railroad trestle across the river through the town of Radford to the front porch of a house and stopped at the front door of none other than Stephen Epperly. The dog also identified the blue towel from a towel lineup, and he located Epperly's car in the police parking lot and led police inside the building to the room Epperly was sitting in. Strangely, Epperly responded, "That's a damn good dog." Epperly's friend, Bill King, testified that about a week after Gina disappeared, he had a conversation with Epperly where he asked if he killed Gina. He said that Epperly replied, "We'll just have to wait and see." The most damning of Epperly's own inculpatory statements came from the testimony of William Cranwell. William was the last prosecution witness to be called and testified that Epperly asked him, "What can they do to me if they do not find the body?" This statement was made on Tuesday before Epperly had even told the authorities he had been with Gina before he failed the polygraph test and before he officially became a suspect. In early December of 1980, 6 months after Gina was last seen alive, Epperly was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He became the first person in Virginia to be convicted of first-degree murder in a case with nobody, confession, or eyewitness, and only the fourth in U.S. history. The Hall family actively campaigned and fought against Epperly's parole request throughout the decades. Decades later, in 2016, a new lead came into Radford Police Department about a man named Lincoln Duncan, who saw 2 men driving a white van dismembering a body in Meadow Creek that he believed was Gina. To this day, the second man seen in the creek with Epperly is still unknown. This new information was the reason Gina's sister Delana was brought back into the specifics of Gina's case. Delana, strong in her faith, later became an unstoppable force, finding answers to her sister's last night alive, as well as getting her some long overdue justice. She wanted to clear up many lies surrounding her sister and the events of that night, especially those who say her sister willingly went with Epperly, which she says is most definitely not true. She has even authored 2 books on the matter. She has also been determined to find her sister's remains and has literally dug up riverbeds. In 2020, Delana was introduced to Dr. R. Padvass, a forensic anthropologist who had invented an instrument known as the quantum oscillator, which can detect human remains even if buried beneath the surface. This one-of-a-kind instrument is based on resonant frequency and is designed to search and respond to the matching frequency unique to an individual and their genetic family. Dr. Vass stated that he could find your ancestor's grave by using hair, fingernails, etc. from a related family member and placing it in his instrument. In Gina's case, her mother's sample was put into the device and miraculously identified numerous positive signals in areas suspected of containing her remains. For excavations for Gina's remains would eventually result in soil test proof of human decomposition and the unearthing of human bones as well as other items. Since then, Gina's bone fragments have been retrieved from several different excavation sites. Gina's positive signal was identified in 8 different locations throughout the New River Valley using the device. They received a very strong positive signal in the exact corner of the lake house where blood splatter proved Gina was beaten unmercifully. The most significant of the excavations was 6 miles from Meadow Creek, where Lincoln Duncan said he saw her being dismembered. During the excavation, they found a gold bracelet, shoe remnants, and cloth fibers in addition to her remains. The bracelet is believed to be Gina's missing wrist bracelet that was never found. In August 2020, 40 years after Gina's murder, the new owner of the Epperly house helped Dr. Voss and Elena cut a square out of the wood floor in Epperly's old second-floor bedroom. On the subfloor, the doctor and Elena discovered hundreds of dead bottle flies, the kind that quickly flocked to human decomposition. Also in that small space were tiny human bone fragments retrieved from under Epperly's bedroom closet subfloor. The retrieved bone fragments were separated based on 4 different frequencies. The bone fragments were found to have belonged to 4 different females, leaving many to believe he was possibly a serial killer. The sample that gave the positive signal that led them to the specific area of the former Epperly house belonged to the family of 14-year-old Angela Rader, a girl who disappeared from Roanoke on the same day as her friend, 14-year-old Tammy Lynn Akers, in 1977. Angela's sample led to the discovery of the bone fragments of 2 other Caucasian females and 1 African-American female. 3 of them remain unidentified and are assumed to be runaways who were never reported missing. Epperly had allegedly told a former cellmate of his that he had kept Gina's index finger. This is what led them to search the former Epperly home. Interestingly, Angie's brother's sample was used in the device not only to locate that very specific spot in the upstairs bedroom closet subfloor of the Epperly house, but also other areas of interest in Pulaski County. Delana and Dr. Vass used the bone fragments of the other unidentified females in the quantum oscillator and followed their signals from Roanoke South. The positive areas paint an interesting picture of Stephen Epperly and the trail of his victims. In regards to Gina's remains, Delana is in the process of working with a genealogy expert who will help her coordinate a Canadian DNA lab that has been successful in extracting ancient DNA from degraded bones. She will then have the help of a second lab based in the US. This lab will profile the extracted DNA and then match the extracted DNA to the DNA from Gina's recently deceased birth mother's tissue sample. The genealogy expert helping guide her through this process is highly respected in her field, sometimes working with the smallest DNA sample. This will all be at Delana's own expense. She is also hoping, at a minimum, to inquire if the Canadian lab would be able to retrieve DNA from the smaller bone fragments of the unidentified girls. During a recent visit by the state authorities with Delana, she asked them if they would like the information on these professionals she has chosen to work with. Basically, she asked them to work with her as Gina's case is complex. She was advised during their visit that there is cold case grant money. She then asked if they would consider using some of the grant money to help, and if so, she will initiate the same forensic testing for Angela and the 3 unidentified girls. The tiny bone fragments collected from Epperly's closet are still in Delana's possession, as are the bones excavated from Gina's locations. In July 2021, Stephen Epperly's latest parole request was denied. Several books have been written regarding Gina's case, including the 2 authored by her sister Delana. Her first book is titled The Miraculous Journey, A Day Made in Heaven. In this book, Delana shares the 2016 experiences that brought her back to the New River Valley to relive 1980, retracing Gina's footsteps. Delana also asked to read Gina's case files, which led to facts in Gina's case being unveiled. These facts led to her second book, Web of Lies Unveiled, A Day Made in Hell, which is still in the works and currently being edited. This 400,000-word case study shares the known and the unknown details about her sister's murder, the investigation, the case file facts, and the trial. It is written in a day-by-day, minute-by-minute chronological format, unveiling the factual details and events as they unfolded, including information never shared with the public. Delana's purpose in sharing this now is to have one factual resource for the true story of Gina Hall and put an end to the lies that continue to be spun about her sister's life still 4 decades later. Delana writes, Gina deserves her voice to be heard. Light will shine in the dark and truth will prevail.